and they do a project on your behalf with maybe a minimal involvement of the local staff, and they take away with them. So this big brother approach is something that we find is one of the weaknesses of our movement as Transparency International. Despite the fact that there are 90 chapters, despite the fact that 60 of those 90 chapters are in the Global South, the Global South chapters are the weakest in the whole movement. And when we have conversations at global level as a movement, it seems like a very normal thing to say. Our chapters in the South are weak, but there's no interest to look deeply into the causes of that weakness. There's no embarrassment on the part of the leadership that we basically are disadvantaged by our failure to retain the right level and right competency of personnel. And we cannot do that if we cannot adequately fundraise. And if we can't do that, it means that there are many issues that fall under the thematic areas at the global and regional level that we cannot take advantage of. There are many tools developed by Transparency International, for example, at the global level that are world-renowned, like the Corruption Perception Index, which we have no clue how they are developed because it's all being done at the secretariat level. And we get calls from the media, we get calls from academics. We don't agree with your score. How did you come up with the indicators? And we are not involved in those conversations, but we're supposed to defend the index and to defend the scores.
And can I ask you to bring it to a close in a few minutes?
Okay, in a few minutes.
Just to give
so this speaks to the capacity at the human capacity level. That we don't have that capacity because the way the organization has been structured is not in a manner that is collaborative and that creates partnerships and that builds the empowerment of chapters and builds capacity within the chapters. Then lastly, we don't have the social capital in the sense that we don't have direct access to GTZ, direct access to USID or to DFID. When we had problems in Zimbabwe with fundraising, for example, with GTZ, we had to come all the way to head office and get someone who knows a parliamentarian within the German structure to talk to them so that they can consider Transparency International Zimbabwe. But we're part of this very prestigious family of Transparency International, and I found it quite absurd that we had to go through those lengths because clearly the name, the brand, is not carrying all the weight all the way through from the global to the national level. And this is something that I see reflected in other international NGOs. But I've only spoke about transparency because this is where I work and this is where I can properly critique the strengths and the weaknesses of the relationship between the global secretariat that operates as an international NGO and the chapters that operate as a national NGO.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you so much. Before I give one of the questions to respond, let me just say, for those who came later, there's pizza and drinks there, and there are interesting literature here from the Open Society foundations that you should feel free to take, those of you who didn't have access to those. So
feel free to take and not to take.
Okay.
Do
you want to respond to?
Thanks so much, Tosmi. So I think that's it's a well-argued and strident case that I can actually identify with, and maybe that's a surprise. I think the issues that you articulate are some of the most significant weaknesses of the sector more broadly. And I actually think it's legitimate to be impatient about them because they are serious weaknesses. I would like to first add maybe to what you've characterized, three things that I also find to be weaknesses. And then I'll go into the second part, where I'll briefly react maybe to some of those issues, and perhaps suggest a paradigm that we may want to use to think about these issues in the space in which we are located, not only as practitioners, but as scholars, public intellectuals, and people who are sitting in spaces such as this one, where we have an opportunity to think about how we might reconstitute and reimagine some of these relationships. I would first add one additional problem, which is that you also find an important differential in the manner in which knowledge is respected within international networks. So there will be a lot invariably that you will know as chapters in the Global South. There will be a lot that you would have generated as information, as knowledge on the ground. But the way it is mediated within international networks tends to be skewed in favor of knowledge approaches and epistemologies that are based in the North. For the simple reason that, as you rightly say, I mean, this is where the networks exist for processing information and knowledge to a certain level of complexity and intensity. And therefore, the scattergram of things that Global Southern chapters will know may invariably not percolate with as much clarity and intensity as will the things that are known in the Global North. And this practically happens in a context where you might say, for instance, if you were to collate the different ideas that have been generated perhaps in the different chapters of Transparency International, in the 60 or so chapters in the Global South, you might find that it's a very rich canvas. But because of lack of time, because of lack of organic networks with universities, such as you would have if you were sitting here, where the Maxwells of this world, or the Transnational NGO initiative of this world, Kennedy School of Governments of this world, and so on, would provide you with the space to actually process that knowledge. You find that it actually ends up framing the knowledge outcomes that are coming from your 60 or so chapters in the South as being somewhat inferior or even irrelevant. And I think that's part of the problem. And a second additional issue that I would raise is, I think the question of understanding the changing nature of global geopolitics and how much within transnational NGOs and their relationship with local actors we are probably missing in that area. And I will take two examples. So 10 or 15 years ago, you would have talked about economic policy with respect to international organizations without failing to acknowledge the role that the IMF and the World Bank play, in particular from Washington, D.C. But if you are talking about them today and about the same phenomenon or same phenomena today, it would be remiss for you not to acknowledge that there are many devolved centers of power for the global financial architecture that we need to respond to and engage with. So, for instance, that of course Washington, D.C. might to an extent have been overtaken by the role of China, to an extent, as I say, that we need to account for within the cosmos or the cosmology of our knowledge about what's happening internationally, or that the World Bank and the IMF themselves would have devolved a number of operations and processes that they used to hold through Washington, D.C. to country assistance strategies, to poverty reduction strategy plans, and so on the ground, to regionally mediated processes, and so on and so forth. And one could go on. And I think the failure to catch up with this reality is in itself, in my view, part of the weakness of the current developmental model in the sense that we end up with a structure of organization and relationships that responds more to the old reality and less to the new reality. And the third and last additional critique that I would add to the useful points that Mary Jane put on the table is that we also have, in my view today, a situation where there's so much dynamic relationships or sets of dynamic relationships that are happening between or in new democracies and in new spaces between NGOs and the political space. So take, for instance, transitions that have happened recently, well, let's say just in the last 3 weeks or even 3 months, for argument's sake. If you take spaces like Cote d'Ivoire in terms of what has just happened, if you take spaces like Guinea in terms of what has recently happened, if you take other spaces, there are new relationships that are occurring in those spaces between civil society organizations and the state. And I think by failing to realize that these are also now centers of power in activism and dynamism, where policy decisions are being taken in a manner that wasn't happening before. Again, I think we risk a model of transnational NGOs supposing that the old models of public policy modeling or discussion are still working without question. So in other words, if you take a practical question, let's say the issue of how you might structure contracts in the extractive industries sector, where in the past you would have heard, as Tosca, you know from your experiences, a great deal of handbooks and materials coming out of Washington, D.C. on this. Today you have intelligent and sophisticated conversations that may happen, for instance, between the Liberian state, between Ellen Sirleaf Johnson and civil society, Samuel and others, that might actually either displace completely the competitive space that the previous discourse would otherwise have gained, or alternatively that needs to be mediated or negotiated with these new actors. Put differently, you may find that, for instance, where in the past we would have had public policy and international public policy questions having a center of gravity in the north. Centers of gravity today are dissipated in terms of public policy. And because they are dissipated, they are devolved, I think the actors themselves also need to be realigned in terms of power in various areas. And I think this has not happened adequately. I'll then pause there, and I think we can discuss more perhaps in the question and answer and commentary. But I would like then to suggest a couple of critical lenses that we may want to use perhaps as we reflect on this. So, given all these weaknesses, what are the issues? And to my mind, I think there are 3 or so important questions. I think one is the necessity to differentiate in a very sophisticated and skillful way the space of transnational NGOs. And I think there are many ways in which obviously one can look at this space. I mean, I think it is possible to construe the role that's being played by your traditional transnational NGOs of the types of your Oxfams, your Action Aids, your Save the Children, and so on and so forth. And think about how some of them are actually evolving within their own systems. So where in the past you would have had 11 Oxfams that were all essentially based in the north, from your Oxfam Great Britain to your Oxfam Novib and Oxfam Spain, Intermod, and so on. Today you can actually have an Oxfam that's also based in a third world country. Where in the past you would have had Action Aid being based from the north, today you would have had the relocation to Johannesburg. I'm sure you guys have spoken with Ramesh, and so some of you have, where they have actually deliberately placed their center of gravity in the south. And I could go on. And so I think it's interesting to actually watch some of these movements and